World War II, The Call of Duty. Chapter 14. Facing the Music, January to March 1943. Written by Liam Dale. Narrated by Liam Dale. As the Second World War entered its fourth year, it had become a confrontation that was truly global. By 1943, more and more nations had been drawn into the conflict as they aligned themselves either with the Allies or with the Axis powers or were held powerless under military occupation. By invading the Soviet Union, Adolf Hitler had taken on a formidable enemy. In the bitter cold of a Russian winter, amid the ruins of a city that had suffered through too many long months, German forces would make a humiliating surrender and many thousands would trudge away as Soviet prisoners of war. The loss of Stalingrad proved a turning point as the Red Army was emboldened to begin a new push against the German occupiers, reclaiming their vast nation piece by piece. Ordinary Germans were increasingly aware of the weighty advantage that the Americans were bringing into play for the Allied war effort. American Air Force bombers joined the RAF in bold raids on ports, industrial centers, and larger cities, sending a message of defiance and determination to Hitler and his generals, and also seeking to further undermine waning public confidence in the Führer's leadership. In 1943, there was also room for optimism in the Pacific War against Japan. For young US Marines, the South Sea island of Guadalcanal was synonymous with anything but a tropical paradise. It had come to mean nights broken by screaming bombs and artillery fire, savage fighting in the sodden jungle, Marines diving for cover into foxholes as Japanese planes strafed the landscape, while the Americans below battled malaria and dysentery as well as dodging sniper fire. But Japan's once tenacious hold on Guadalcanal was slowly but surely being loosened, and victory came sooner than the American and Australian commanders had dared to hope. Across Southeast Asia, Japanese militarism was still holding diverse nations and populations under its harsh rule, belying Japan's promises that it would lead Asian nations into a bright new future. The Second World War posed a real dilemma to anti-colonial nationalists in the region. Should they believe in Japan's promises or throw their lot in with the Allies? However, the often barbaric treatment of local populations by their new Japanese overlords helped settle the matter, and colonialism definitely seemed the lesser of two evils. What's more, America's President Roosevelt was carefully building a relationship of cooperation with China, a nation at war with Japan since 1937. The Chinese were firmly on the side of an Allied victory, despite reservations about cooperating with the West. Also in North Africa, the Allies received a favourable reception from the indigenous population. They watched as largely mute observers as the tides of war ebbed and flowed across their lands. A clash between European titans was being acted out, thankfully, was largely fought in the barren deserts beyond their cities. For the Allies, success in the sands and rocky hills of North Africa gave hope that an end to Hitler's brand of National Socialism and its evil ideology of racial purity was now in sight. As 1943 began, the US and British troops that had made surprise landings along the coast of Morocco and Algeria at the onset of winter were still attempting to push eastwards, hoping to link up eventually with the forces under British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Monty's Eighth Army was advancing along the Mediterranean coast from the other direction, hot on the heels of the retreating Germans led by Field Marshal Rommel, Hitler's Desert Fox. Montgomery's hard-won victory over Rommel's forces on the desert battlefield at El Alamein in Libya had been a huge boost to British morale. Nonetheless, the Allied breakthrough at El Alamein had prompted Hitler to give greater strategic importance to North Africa. Along with his Italian ally Mussolini, Hitler had sent more men and equipment into the region by sea and air from Sicily. Also, Allied successes in North Africa had prompted Hitler to order the direct occupation of the southeastern part of France, which, until this point, had been administered by the pro-Nazi French government based in the town of Vichy. All France was now directly under the iron hand of the Nazis, and most of the rest of Europe was either under direct Nazi rule or was ruled by governments that had fallen into line with Hitler. And the Führer's plans for a new order based on ideas of racial supremacy were escalating. The focus of Hitler's hatred was European Jews, and in the previous 9 months, 5 death camps in Nazi-occupied Poland had started their murderous operations. In America, meanwhile, public opinion remained united behind President Roosevelt in support of the war against Germany and the Axis powers, including, of course, Japan. The devastating Japanese attack on Pearl was not something that would be easily forgotten or ever forgiven. The Japanese were seeking to eliminate U.S. naval power in the Central Pacific in order to secure access to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, as modern-day Indonesia was then known, as well as other resource-rich territories to the south. A resurgent Japan had aligned itself with the Nazi drive for supremacy in Europe, while in Asia, the Japanese government considered that they were the only nation with the industrial and military might to end centuries of Western dominance. By January 1943, Japan had already wrested control of the Philippines from the American and Filipino defending forces. The Japanese had also taken Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore from the British, and Indonesia from the Dutch. In Burma, bordering India, where agitation for independence from Britain was growing, Japanese forces had marched in, facing little opposition. But for months, American and Australian troops had been battling with the Japanese by land and sea in the Solomon Islands, north of Papua New Guinea. Eventually, the Japanese military commanders decided to cut their losses and evacuate what was left of their forces from the key Solomon island of Guadalcanal. As the Japanese head of state, the Emperor Hirohito, gave his formal approval for the retreat, the Allies were given hope that perhaps the string of Japanese victories in Southeast Asia might be coming to an end. And on the other side of the world, amid the snows of a Russian winter, the Germans were also meeting tough opposition, as Soviet and Nazi troops were locked in a war of attrition. The momentous confrontation between Hitler's Germany and the Soviet Union, which had started when the Nazis had marched across the border from occupied Poland a year and a half earlier, was by January 1943 entering its final tragic act. Hitler had expected the communist regime of Joseph Stalin to crumble from within, but this Eastern Front had proved an ever more perilous drain on the human and military resources of the Third Reich. The Germans had discovered, to their cost, just how determined the Red Army was to resist them. Now, a second harsh Russian winter was sapping the morale of the cold and exhausted German soldiers, and nowhere more so than at the city of Stalingrad on the mighty Volga River. Stalingrad, today known as Volgograd, lies a full 600 miles south of Moscow, but its position allowed it to control the shipping of supplies by river to the north of the Soviet Union. The factories of its industrial zone had continued to produce tractors and armaments in spite of war and invasion. And beyond the city to the south lay the oil-rich Caucasus region, which the Soviets considered a vital part of their empire. For all these reasons, the city of Stalingrad had attracted Hitler's attention, and the previous summer it had endured a massive bombardment from the Luftwaffe while the German Sixth Army attempted to encircle it by land. As the city was reduced to rubble, the death toll mounted into the tens and then hundreds of thousands. Russians, both civilians and military personnel alike, bore by far the heaviest burden of casualties. But then, in November 1942, a counter-offensive by the Red Army had trapped the German forces, along with some contingents from the Romanian and Italian armies, in a pocket of land on the west bank of the river and had prevented German reinforcements from breaking through. Supplies were dwindling fast, and typhus was spreading among the German troops and the other national contingents fighting alongside them. Just 9 days into the new year of 1943, as the winter drifts still lay thick outside the city, a Russian captain appeared before German lines with a white flag. He was offering General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army, the opportunity to make an honourable surrender. Paulus was an experienced strategist, having begun his military career before the First World War, who was doing his best to carry out the Führer's orders to hold Stalingrad at all costs. However, there was little he could do, and Paulus and his men realized that they would be expected to fight to the death. After the Germans had held out for as long as they could, on the evening of the last day of January, the Red Army battered its way into the city, forcing Paulus to retreat into a former department store. But the Russians soon captured him in the basement of the building, lying fully dressed on his camp bed. He and his men had no more fight left in them. To all intents and purposes, the nightmare that had been the battle for Stalingrad was over. Elsewhere, the signs were equally ominous for the German invaders. On January 18th, their blockade around Russia's second most important city, Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, had been broken. The Russians freed up a narrow corridor of land through which more supplies could at least be brought in for the city's famished and disease-ridden population, and more civilians could be evacuated to safety. Stalin had for some time been pressing the United States and Britain to open up a front in Western Europe to take some of the pressure off the Soviet Union. Although a second front in Europe was not yet possible, Allied progress in North Africa had already diverted some of the Axis military resources away from Russia. As Allied forces in North Africa took a time out, bogged down by the winter rains, on the highest political level moves were afoot to agree upon what should be done next. As the fighting in Stalingrad was entering its last desperate phase, two men were booked into the Anfa Hotel in Casablanca, Morocco's main seaport, under the false names of Admiral Q and Mr. P. Hotel staff were astounded to see that the two were in fact America's President Roosevelt, who had flown in via West Africa, and Prime Minister Churchill, who arrived from London in a converted bomber. Stalin had been invited to join them, but had sent a message saying he could not leave his country at such a crucial moment. However, he made sure he reminded the two leaders that they had promised to open a second front in Europe that spring. Morocco was a French protectorate previously controlled by commanders loyal to France's Vichy government. It now represented a secure meeting place for the two leaders, as after the Allies had arrived, senior French commander Admiral Darlan had renounced his loyalty to Vichy and formally ceded to the United States the right to oversee all ports, transport and troop movements. When Darlan was assassinated by a dissident Frenchman just weeks later, his place as administrator of North Africa had been taken by another former Vichy supporter, General Henri Giraud. He had been groomed for this role by the Americans, much to the displeasure of another French general, Charles de Gaulle. He'd opposed Nazism and the Vichy government from the start, and as commander of the Free French forces based in London, had become a symbol of French resistance. The two French generals were also persuaded to attend the 9 days of talks at the Anfa Hotel that would go down in history as the Casablanca Conference, where they were obliged to keep their hostility within diplomatic bounds. Between Roosevelt and Churchill, relations were far easier, as it was the fourth time that the two leaders had met since the war began. As the Casablanca Conference ended, Roosevelt told the press that he and Churchill had agreed that the war would continue until the Allies secured an unconditional surrender. There would be no deals with the enemy, and those responsible for atrocities would be put on trial. In fact, the Allies had decided on this policy before Casablanca. There was criticism in the US and Britain over the policy of working in North Africa with former Vichy commanders who had previously collaborated with the Nazis. Roosevelt and Churchill therefore needed to re-emphasize that their goal was the total defeat of Nazism and all its grotesque ideology. And as a signal to Stalin, Roosevelt also told the listening reporters that he wanted to pay tribute to the enormous weight of the war that Russia was bearing. However, some of the most important decisions taken at Casablanca had inevitably to be kept out of the public arena. The first was the decision that the second front to be opened against Nazi Germany in Europe would initially be via Sicily or Sardinia and on to mainland Italy rather than through northwestern France. It had also been decided that an invasion across the English Channel would not be possible in 1943. There were as yet not enough American troops in England, nor sufficient boats ready for there to be a major landing in France. Nevertheless, serious planning for this invasion to take place in 1944 began. Another unpublicized outcome of the meeting at Casablanca was an agreement that bombing raids over Germany by American and British bombers would aim to draw German fighter power away from the Russian and Mediterranean theaters of war. The bombing would also be targeted to destroy Germany's military and industrial infrastructure and, in the words of the agreement, undermine the morale of the German people to a point where their capacity for an armed resistance is fatally weakened. As for the two French generals, they reached their own resolution at the conference, agreeing to share authority in French North Africa, which they hoped from now on would remain under Allied control. Even so, North Africa was proving far more accommodating for the newly landed Allies, and the road through Tunisia to link up with Montgomery's men was challenging, to say the least. They had crossed the border into Tunisia weeks earlier, but had been held in a check by German units and winter rains, which had made the roads impassable. In the capital, Tunis, which lay so temptingly close to the Italian island of Sicily, the Germans and Italians had been building up a new military presence, redeploying transport planes from the Eastern Front. The French commander in Tunis remained loyal to Vichy and was allowing the Germans to use Tunisian airfields for this airlift. While the Italian Navy struggled with a shortage of oil, the Allies suffered from a lack of sufficient ships to transport their troops down across the Mediterranean, even with civilian craft such as cruise liners pressed into service. After the Battle of El Alamein, Rommel would never again be able to hold a firm front against Montgomery and his men, who included South Africans, Indians, New Zealanders, and others alongside British soldiers. At first light, on January 23rd, a British tank with 7 Gordon Highlanders clinging to it rumbled into the deserted Libyan capital of Tripoli after coming along an empty but heavily mined coast road where every bridge had been demolished by the retreating Axis force. The Allied tanks that followed found that Hitler's Desert Fox and his men had already retreated, and Montgomery was able to accept the surrender of the city from its Italian mayor, who donned his full regalia for the occasion. The capture of Tripoli meant Rommel, now falling back towards Tunisia, had lost his main supply base, and the Italians had lost the last part of their African empire. However, although the Nazis were losing their stranglehold on North Africa, they were still dominant throughout Europe, and there was no stopping their reign of terror in the nations they occupied. By early 1943, 5 death camps were in operation in occupied Poland. Unlike the concentration camps, where the Nazis imprisoned a range of political and religious opponents and people they judged socially deviant, the death camps were expressly built for the purpose of carrying out killing on an industrial scale. Victims of the death camps included Poles, Hungarians, and Soviet prisoners of war, but it was the Jews, often transported there from all over Europe, who were the main target. Presiding over this genocide was Heinrich Himmler, one of the most powerful of Hitler's henchmen. Himmler's SS operated police and military units alongside the regular German army, and its members were recruited for their ideological commitment to Nazism and their supposed racial purity. The SS was a prototype of the master race that Hitler dreamt of. In Poland, the capital, Warsaw, had been home to the majority of the country's Jews. More than 2 years previously, the Germans had forced all Warsaw Jews to move into a designated walled area known as the ghetto. All movement in and out was controlled by armed guards, effectively cutting the Jews off from the outside world, where, in overcrowded conditions, typhus and tuberculosis spread like wildfire and malnutrition was rife. Some 330,000 Jews had by 1943 already been deported from the Warsaw Ghetto, but about 60,000 remained. So it came as a shock for the German guards when in mid-January a small rebellion broke out, a precursor to the more famous uprising. For the first time, the Jews held in the Warsaw Ghetto, which had become, in effect, a waiting room for the death camps, had attempted to strike back, and it gave the Nazis a taste of what lay ahead. Back in Germany, ordinary people going about their everyday lives were also beginning to feel disillusioned with Hitler and the Nazi regime, particularly as by the end of the month, both the American Air Force and the RAF had been bombing major targets, including Berlin. On January 16th, the RAF had returned to Berlin after 14 months away. The city was hit by 8,000 sizable bombs and thousands of smaller incendiaries, and the intensive bombing continued for a second night. 10 days later, American bombers made their first raids on the German homeland, in a daylight raid on the Wilhelmshaven naval base. Next, Hamburg itself came under fire, and on Saturday, January 30th, the RAF marked Nazi Germany's 10th anniversary with 2 daytime bombing raids over the country. The second, in the afternoon, was timed to spoil a radio broadcast of a celebratory speech by Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. Whatever doubts the people of Germany might be having, and any questions asked by Hitler's closest associates about his state of mind, Goebbels was the most constantly loyal of them all. And never before had the eloquent skills of Joseph Goebbels been more in demand, particularly as news of Germany losing the Battle of Stalingrad started to filter through. Stalingrad was the Nazis' first large-scale military defeat, and there would be no hiding the scale of the losses from the already disheartened German public. On February 2nd, the last Axis units in the Russian city's industrial zone finally followed General Paulus's example and laid down their arms. The tally of casualties at Stalingrad speaks for itself. On the Axis side, at least 120,000 men had died, while 91,000 soldiers, including 24 Nazi generals, had been taken as prisoners of war. Only about 5,000 of these prisoners would ever make it home. More than a quarter perished in the immediate days after their capture, weakened by disease, malnutrition, and lack of medical care. On the Russian side, the civilian population of Stalingrad had been decimated, while the Red Army's casualties were even higher than the Germans. Some estimate that up to 250,000 Russian troops had been killed, captured, or wounded in the city. In his field headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia, Hitler berated his generals. The crushing defeat at Stalingrad had heightened his distrust of his senior officer corps, many of whom had been career soldiers long before they were Nazis. And Hitler's unease was well-founded, not least because, after Stalingrad, General Paulus became one of the leaders of a Soviet-sponsored League of German Officers, making radio broadcasts in which he urged his fellow officers to overthrow Hitler. In Berlin, Goebbels addressed a mass rally in a rousing speech broadcast across Germany by radio. The audience that packed the stadium had been carefully selected and roared approval as Goebbels urged the German nation to redouble its efforts against what he described as the Bolshevist threat from the East. Only now, after Stalingrad, was the full scale of this threat understood, he said. But the German people would follow Hitler through thick and thin, as he put it. Do you want total war? He bellowed. If necessary, do you want a war more total and radical than anything we can yet imagine? The audience rose to its feet, chanting their support. But approval for Hitler was definitely fading. Shoppers in Munich city centre were stunned to see anti-Nazi graffiti on the walls, and at the city's university, students even dared to protest, chanting, "Down with Hitler." An underground student group, the White Rose, had been circulating anti-Nazi letters in a number of cities for several months. The White Rose students were non-violent. Some had seen service on the Eastern Front, and one of them had witnessed the treatment of Polish Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto by the German oppressors and could not get the images out of his mind. Isn't it true that every German is ashamed of his government these days? The first letter read. Who can imagine the degree of shame when the awful crimes that infinitely exceed any human measure are exposed to the light of day? Not surprisingly, the Nazis quickly crushed the movement before it could grow into something more dangerous. The Gestapo secret police were tipped off, and the two ringleaders, Hans Scholl, a 25-year-old medical student, and his sister Sophie, a biology student aged just 21, were executed in late February along with a third student. 3 more White Rose activists would share their fate before the year was out, paying the highest price for voicing what many in Germany were by now thinking. While defeat at Stalingrad had dealt a mighty blow to the prestige of the German military in Europe, in the Pacific, the image of the Japanese army as an unbeatable, efficient military machine was also beginning to crumble. The Allies had chosen the little-known string of Solomon Islands in the South Pacific as a starting point for their fight back against Japan. When the Japanese occupied some of the larger islands, American and Australian troops made their own landings on one of them, Guadalcanal. The island had an airfield under construction, and if the Japanese could seize control and get it operational, they would most certainly be able to threaten supply routes between the US, Australia, and New Zealand. Throughout the autumn and winter of 1942, the Japanese put up a fierce fight by land, sea and air, while islanders sympathetic to the Allies kept a lookout for the movements of the Japanese military. Early in 1943, American troops were advancing along the north of Guadalcanal. The airfield was already in US hands, but they feared a renewed Japanese offensive. Little did they suspect that the Japanese commanders had already received their emperor's blessing for a withdrawal, and the naval maneuvers were actually in preparation for an evacuation of thousands of Japanese troops. By the end of the first week of February, more than 10,000 Japanese soldiers had been taken off the island before the Allies even realized that the battle for Guadalcanal was over. From this point on, Guadalcanal would be a major Allied base with new runways and a port. It had cost American lives of 1,700 soldiers and 5,000 were wounded, but the eventual goal, the retaking of the Philippines, no longer looked quite such an impossible task. What's more, American shipyards were working at full steam, producing warships that the Japanese could not hope to match. For Japan, the loss of 860 aircraft and 15 warships with their highly trained crews was going to be a major issue. The defeat led the Japanese military to carry out a major reappraisal of their strategy. They resolved to hold on to central New Guinea and take a defensive stance along the southern perimeter of their area of control. Despite the setback at Guadalcanal, Japan's determination to present itself as the leader of a newly awakened Asia had the potential to seriously undermine the Allied war effort. Nowhere was this more so than India, once considered the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, where the British Army had traditionally been supplied with large numbers of Indian recruits. But the battle for an independent India was already gathering pace. By 1943, the Indian nationalist leader Mahatma Gandhi had been detained because he had declared that India should be granted immediate independence if it was to carry on supporting the Allied war effort. As a consequence, there had been mass arrests of Gandhi's supporters, while police released a barrage of lethal gunfire against unarmed demonstrators. In eastern India, the local population was no longer in awe of their British overlords, having seen their humiliating retreat from Burma the previous year, and had resorted to sabotaging railways and telegraph lines. The loss of Burma had, at a stroke, deprived India of 15% of its supply of rice, the staple upon which India's poor so depended. Therefore, the British quickly realized that it was vital to regain control of Burma to quell the rebellions in India, as well as to defeat the Japanese. With Japan controlling much of China's eastern seaboard, the famous Burma Road had been the main route for getting supplies to Chinese nationalist forces deep in the country's interior. But with this road now closed by the Japanese, the Allies needed to open another route to make sure that supplies to China could be maintained. America's President Roosevelt believed firmly that China's assistance was vital in the battle against the Japanese, and had persuaded the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek to accept American leader General Joe Stilwell as his military advisor, with the title of Commander-in-Chief. At a meeting in New Delhi on February 7th, Chiang Kai-shek agreed to provide manpower to help reconquer Burma in exchange for US aid. Stilwell was already supervising the building of a new road from Lado in India to link up with the final stretch of the Burma Road. Work on this ambitious feat of engineering was making slow progress through early 1943, drawing on the labor of some 15,000 US soldiers, most of them African Americans, and 35,000 Indians. Tropical diseases took their toll. Hundreds of US soldiers died during the construction of the Lado Road, as well as many of the local people who were also involved. US Air Force commanders thought the road would never be as effective as the hazardous airdrops of supplies they were organizing across the mountains to the Chinese, and over time, unfortunately, they would be proved right. A British land offensive against the Japanese on Burma's western Arakan coast on the Bay of Bengal was making similarly slow progress. The British and Indian soldiers were finding that their Japanese enemies were well trained and battle-hardened. This first Arakan campaign did at least benefit from groundbreaking research that had been done to find a drug effective in protecting troops against malaria. As February progressed, the British desperately needed a morale boost, and success in Burma would certainly deliver it. With perfect timing, a special forces unit that had been training across the border in India found themselves in the media spotlight. Plans were in place for them to get behind Japanese lines in Burma and generally disrupt enemy supplies by destroying transport systems wherever possible, and their British commander told newspaper reporters that this special force would be called the Chindits, after a mythical Burmese lion. Numbering some 3,000 men, the Chindits crossed the border from India deep into Burma but found the terrain much more difficult than expected. The forces did succeed in blowing up a number of bridges and clashed with Japanese infantry divisions, but by the end of March received orders to return to India. Nevertheless, despite only actually managing to take out Japanese railway communications for less than a week, the story of the Chindits was given plenty of media coverage, and it certainly improved British morale in India and back at home. Evidently, it would be possible, with better planning, to actually undermine the Japanese in jungle warfare. As 1943 progressed, the Allies certainly found themselves needing to adapt their military strategy to fit a variety of inhospitable terrains. The Burmese jungle, without doubt, called for guerrilla tactics, but the wide horizons of North Africa provided the stage for more classic military strategies. The American General Dwight D. Eisenhower was now given overall authority for the Allied military effort in the whole Mediterranean region, with Britain's General Montgomery reporting directly to him. Eisenhower was an unusual military commander in that he had never seen action himself, but with his consummate skill and experience of mediation and diplomacy, he had secured the respect of all the frontline commanders, which was, in point of fact, quite a remarkable achievement. Nevertheless, Eisenhower had a difficult time ahead of him, and he would need total cooperation from all those he commanded. On February the 12th, in driving rain, the Allies' 7th Armoured Division crossed the border from Libya into Tunisia. All Libya was now in Allied hands, and Montgomery was able to oversee the unloading of fresh equipment and supplies at the newly cleared harbour in Tripoli. Worryingly, some 17,000 Italian and German forces were now in place in Tunis, and it was imperative to stop Rommel linking up with them. In mid-February, Rommel drove westwards to head off the Allied forces who had their main supply base in the Algerian town of Tebessa, just over the border from Tunisia. But the road to Tebessa wound along a narrow mountain track known as the Kasserine Pass. This was the setting for the first large-scale meeting of American and German forces in World War II, and the untested US troops suffered heavy casualties. The Americans' light guns and tanks stood little chance against the heavier German equipment, but within days the Allies had regained control of the pass thanks to the use of strategically accurate air power. At last it seemed that time was running out for Hitler's Desert Fox, and back in Britain, anything that improved morale was very much appreciated. In March 1943, the British public was still bearing up under the austerity and the uncertainties of wartime life. So far, civilian casualties in Britain outnumbered those lost in the ranks of the nation's armed forces, but the relentless nightly German bombing of the London Blitz was long past. Many of those who had left the capital for safety had returned, and everyone was making do, the best that they could, amidst all the rationing and shortages. Government information campaigns had managed to convince the public that rationing was something to be tolerated with good humour, and more people were realizing that the best way to have a ready supply of fresh food was to keep chickens and cultivate a patch of ground on the local allotment or in their garden if they had one. Ironically, the deprivations of war did have one positive side effect in Britain, doing away with the mass unemployment of the interwar years as soaring government spending covered the costs of keeping Britain on an even keel. Lessons were being learned daily as Britain pulled together in order to survive, and proposals were made that after the war a new system should be introduced that we now know as national insurance to provide a minimum standard of living for everyone. Also, a national health service would be necessary that would offer health care for all, rather than doctors only being available to those who could pay. The Beveridge Report, which detailed the proposals, proved an unlikely bestseller, and a shortened version was printed for distribution amongst the armed services. From the cradle to the grave, a new age beckoned, and as people looked forward to the day when World War II would come to an end, one thing was certain: life would never be the same again. Keeping morale high, both on the home and battlefronts, was of vital importance, and although wartime propaganda is more generally associated with Hitler and his Nazi ideologies, Winston Churchill also kept a watchful eye on what the British press put into print. A prime example was an event of March 2nd, as panic swept through a London Underground station being used as an air raid shelter at Bethnal Green, resulting in the deaths of 173 people. Asphyxiated when the only single station exit open became jammed by people thinking the station was being bombed, it was the largest loss of civilian life in a single accident during the war. Many were women and children, and ironically that night the German bombs they had rushed to escape from killed no one. EastEnders could not understand why the disaster got so little coverage in the newspapers, but there was in fact a very good reason for the media's silence. Winston Churchill had decided that to give the story prominence might well damage morale, and worse still, give valuable ammunition to the German propaganda machine, something he was determined should not happen, so he issued orders for the news to be suppressed. However, by the spring of 1943, awareness of what was happening to European Jews in areas falling under Nazi control was growing, making the Allies more determined than ever that Hitler had to be defeated, and fast. On March 23rd, Himmler was informed that in the region of 1.5 million European Jews had been killed since the outbreak of the war. On that very same day, by pure coincidence, the Archbishop of Canterbury stood up in the House of Lords in London and pleaded with the British government to help the Jews of Europe. "We at this moment have upon us a tremendous responsibility," he said. "We stand at the bar of history, of humanity, and of God." The British authorities had known what was going on in the concentration camps for some time, thanks to the code-breaking activities at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, which monitored all Nazi communications. Reports also reached them from the Polish underground movement, and the World Jewish Congress in Geneva was doing its best to alert the British government to what was really going on. Ironically, some civil servants and British politicians dismissed the stories as propaganda, while others were concerned about the possibility of what they called a flood of alien immigrants. Winston Churchill firmly believed that the best way to help those being treated so appallingly in concentration camps was to press ahead with single-minded determination and defeat Nazi Germany. News from North Africa was extremely positive, and by March, Montgomery had built up a considerable position of strength. He had 400 tanks, while Rommel only had 160, and the Allies were also superior in the skies, having built new airfields in North Africa, which meant they were no longer reliant on their base in Malta. The time had come for the Allies to consider an invasion of Italy, and a bombing raid on Sicily left Hitler in no doubt as to what was being planned. The Führer summoned Rommel from North Africa to discuss what was to be done, and at a meeting in the Ukraine, the Desert Fox begged Hitler to allow the evacuation of Axis troops to Italy, where they could be re-equipped. But neither Hitler nor Mussolini were willing to countenance such an obvious retreat, while Rommel began to tire of the false optimism and failure of the two leaders to be realistic. Meanwhile, back in North Africa, Montgomery was making further advances towards an Allied victory in Tunisia. Before the outbreak of World War II, the French, in their occupation of the north, had built a line of fortifications in southern Tunisia. After losing extensive ground in North Africa to the Allies in Operation Torch back in the autumn of 1942, the Axis powers had managed to hold on to what was known as the Mareth Line, and using minefields, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, and carefully concealed artillery positions, the Germans and Italians had created a defensive stronghold. But Montgomery's star was most definitely in the ascendancy. By the end of March, he'd managed to break through the Mareth line, and it literally was only a matter of weeks before the Allies would gain control of Tunisia. One step closer to a total victory in North Africa, the Allies were already preparing for the invasion of Sicily. Ironically, Rommel was destined never to return to Africa again. For the rest of the war, he would be prominent in Hitler's European operations, but even his great military skill and experience would be no match for the Allies, who were daily gaining ground. The tide really was turning, and even the most downtrodden of Hitler's victims were beginning to feel a sense of hope. In Poland, unbeknown to the Nazis, a major uprising was being planned in Warsaw's Jewish ghetto as the resilience of the human spirit shone through the dark and desperate gloom. As the opening of a new front looked increasingly possible in southern Europe, as the German and Italian forces were slowly but surely losing their foothold in Tunisia, Churchill's determination to push towards a speedy victory was gathering momentum. And better news still was coming from the Pacific theatre of war, as the Allies were at last beginning to gain the upper hand, as the Japanese were forced to face the prospect that their imperial army might not be quite as invincible as they had at first believed.